Мне хотелось бы поблагодарить господина президента,
I would like to thank Mr. President,
председателя Бундестага,
the President,
всё руководство
and all the leaders of the Bundestag,
депутатов за любезное
as well as the
приглашение
deputies for their kind invitation to speak here today
здесь, в такой
on such a big
знаменательный,
day,
во всяком случае для меня,
for me at
день.
least.
Сегодня у нас в Петербурге
People in St. Petersburg are heading for Piskarovskaya Cemetery today.
Петровское кладбище. Это одно из таких
This is one of the city's symbolic burial grounds.
города. Идут для того, чтобы
They are heading there to remember and pay tribute to all those who perished in the years of the siege.
в годы блокады. Кладут на могильные
They are
холмы
laying hardtacks, candies,
сухари,
some biscuits on the grave mounds,
какие-то, значит, свои печенья, лишь бы
to express, at least in this way,
любовь и память
their love and remembrance of the people for whom that was a tragic and cruel story.
трагическая и жестокая история. Она и для меня была.
It was very tragic and cruel for me too.
Я
I
начал
went to
войну,
war from the first days of military action.
записался в народ
I enrolled in the volunteer corps.
добровольцем. Зачем?
Why?
Сегодня я даже не
Now I
знаю,
don't
зачем.
even know why.
Но это, наверное,
Well,
была
I guess it was
чувство
purely a boyhood yearning for romance.
романтики. Как же
How will the war get on without me?
надо.
I absolutely had to participate.
Но ближайшие
The war,
дни
however,
войны,
threw cold water on me and my companions shortly after the beginning,
товарищи, жестоко
and it did it cruelly.
ответили. Нас разбомбили еще
We got under a shell attack as soon as our echelon arrived at the front line.
линии фронта. И с тех пор
Since then,
мы испытывали
we suffered one defeat after another.
за другим, бежали,
We ran,
отступали,
dropped back, and ran
опять
again.
бежали. И, наконец,
Finally,
где-то в середине сентября
somewhere in mid-September,
мой полк
my regiment abandoned the town of Pushkin.
и мы отошли
We retreated behind the city line.
города. Фронт рухнул.
The front collapsed.
Фронт рухнул.
The front
и
collapsed, and the
началась
siege
блокада.
began.
Все связи города,
All communications of the city, this huge city, a real metropolis, were isolated from the mainland.
и началась та блокада, которая
And the siege that lasted for 900 days began.
900 дней. Блокада была
It was so sudden and unexpected,
неожиданной, как
as was the entire
хорошая
war, though.
война. Неожиданной для страны.
Unexpected for the country.
Не было никаких запасов.
There were no supplies, neither fuel nor foodstuffs.
Продовольствия. И вскоре уже
A rationing system was introduced in a little while, sometime in October.
началась карточная система, хлеб выдавали,
Bread was distributed with food stamps.
а затем одно за другим
And then catastrophic events started happening, one after another.
катастрофические явления, как прекратилась подача электроэнергии,
The electricity was cut off.
кончилась
The water pipe ran dry.
водопровод, закончилась возможность
Sewage and heating were no longer possible.
отопления.
and the miseries of the siege began. What is a rationing system? The rationing system can be described as follows. Since the 1st of October, blue-collar workers were allowed 400 grams of bread. White-collar workers were allowed 200 grams. And the allowance was catastrophically cut more and more, starting as early as November. Bread was then rationed at 250 grams to blue-collar workers and at 125 grams to white-collar workers and children. It was a slice of bread, bad bread, half cellulose, oil cake, and other admixtures. No foodstuffs were delivered to the city. Winter was coming, and a harsh winter, as ill luck would have it, with temperatures as low as 30 to 35 degrees below zero. The huge city lost all subsistence. It was mercilessly bombarded every day. It was under constant fire from the air. Our unit was disposed not far from the city, within walking distance of the army headquarters. Sitting in the trenches, we could hear those air bombs burst and even feel the earth shudder. Bombardments continued every day. Fires began. Houses were on fire. Since there was nothing to put them out with, there was no water. Water supply was out. They kept burning for days. Turning around, we were watching from the front line, those plumes of smoke, black smoke, and speculating about what and where was on fire. The streets and squares had been snowed in by December. There were only a few passages yet remaining, cleared for military vehicles. Monuments were sandbagged, showcases battened. The city had transfigured. There was no lighting at night. Patrols and occasional walkers carried lightning bugs with them. People were beginning to lose their stamina from hunger, but kept working, going to factories, especially armament factories, where they repaired tanks, made projectiles and mines. And that's what happened next. What I got to know in detail only when the war was over. Hitler ordered his army not to enter the city. To avoid losses in street fighting, where tanks were unable to engage. Von Leeb's 18th Army beat off all our attempts to break through the siege circle. In fact, the German troops were comfortably expecting, without much difficulty, that the oncoming hunger and frost would make the city capitulate.
Фактически война стала
The war was essentially not a war anymore.
война со стороны противника.
For the enemy, the war was turning into expectation, and quite comfortable expectation, of capitulation.
Я рассказываю об этих подробностях,
I am giving these details that are associated with my own experience as a soldier.
солдатским опытом. Я вообще
In fact, I am not speaking as a writer,
не как свидетель.
nor as a witness.
Я выступаю скорее как солдат.
I am rather speaking as a soldier.
Солдат,
A soldier, a participant in those events who knows little. I have purely trench experience, the trench experience of a junior officer. The experience with its own details, its own impressions that are important enough because it is those impressions that form the way of life.
Они-то и составляли тут быт, ту плоть.
The flesh of events for every person, city inhabitant, and also the soldier of the Leningrad front.
Солдата Ленинградского фронта. Уже в октябре месяце начало
As early as October, the mortality began to rise
потому что при этой
because, with such a catastrophically small food allowance,
норме питания люди
people tended to lose weight to scrawniness
профиками и умирали.
and die.
За 25 дней
40,000 people died over 25 days in December.
тысяч человек. В феврале уже ежедневно
In February,
умирало
3,500 people died from hunger every day.
В декабре месяц
In December,
люди в дневниках
people wrote in their diaries,
писали: Господи,
"Dear God, please let me live till grass begins to grow,
появится зеленый.
till green grass appears."
Всего в городе умерло
Altogether, about 1 million people died in the city from hunger.
миллион человек. Жуков в своих
In his
воспоминаниях
memoirs, Marshal Zhukov writes that 1,200,000 people died.
Смерть
Death
начала
entered the war,
участвовать
silent and still,
и тихо в войне,
trying to make this city surrender.
заставляя этот город сдаться. Считается, что
Hunger is said to have played the biggest part.
значение имел голод. Это не совсем
Well, not exactly.
на состояние людей, на их психике, на их
People's state,
здоровье,
their mind, their health were affected by frost.
морозы, отопления ведь не было,
Again, there was no heating,
морозы,
frost,
отсутствие воды.
lack of water.
Вот я хочу рассказать некоторые,
I would like to tell you some of the details of life,
которые почти
which can hardly be found in any books or descriptions.
в книгах и в описаниях.
What was happening in homes during the siege?
Во время блокады в квартирах, как люди жили.
How people lived.
Знаете, дьявол блокады
The devil of the siege can largely be found in the detail, you know.
именно в этих подробностях. Где брать воду?
Where to get water?
Где?
Where?
Люди ходили, тех, кто жили
Those who lived near canals,
от Невы,
near the Neva, near embankments, would go there,
делали
make ice holes,
и оттуда пытались
get water with buckets,
доставали воду
and carry those buckets home.
и несли домой эти ведра. Несли, вы представляете себе,
Imagine climbing the fourth, the fifth, the sixth floor with those buckets.
с этими ведрами. Те, кто жили подальше, должны
Those who
были
lived
собирать
farther
снег,
had to gather snow and melt it.
Что такое топить?
What does it mean?
Как его топить?
How to melt it?
Топили на бочку.
Using potbelly stoves. These were small iron stoves.
А чем топить?
And what to burn?
Где брать дрова?
Where to get firewood?
Ломали мебель,
They would break their furniture,
взламывали
crush
паркет.
parquet flooring.
Пытались и
They would
разбирать
try and
деревянные
disassemble wooden
здания.
structures in the city.
Уже спустя 35
35 years after the war,
от белорусской
the Belarusian writer Adamovich, together with myself,
начали опрашивать
started asking survivors of the siege
механиков уцелевших о том, как они
about how they were living through it,
с ними
what was
воевали.
happening with them during the siege.
Там были поразительные,
And there were startling,
беспощадные
unsparing revelations.
откровения. У матери
A mother's child dies.
ему 3
He
года.
was 3 years old.
Мать, когда
The mother places the body between the windows.
между окон, это
It's winter.
и каждый день отрезает. Нет, нет, спасибо. Отрезает,
And cuts a piece every day to feed her daughter,
кормить дочь, спасти хотя бы.
to save her daughter at least.
Дочь не знала,
The daughter did not know the details.
ей было 12,
She was 12,
а мать все
but the mother knew.
не позволила
She
себе
didn't let herself die,
умереть и не позволила.
nor did she let herself go mad.
Между прочим,
As it happens, the daughter has grown up,
и я с ней
and I talked to her.
Тогда она
She
не
didn't know
знала, чем
what she was eating then.
а теперь уже спустя
She has got to know it now,
годы
many years after the war.
вы представляете,
Can you imagine?
таких примеров можно
I could give many examples of this kind.
превратилась жизнь.
What became of the lives of the besieged?
В квартирах жили
They
в
lived in the
темноте,
dark,
завешивали
hanging up their
чёрные
windows as best they could in order to keep warmth.
окна для того, чтобы сохранить тепло. И освещали.
And used oil lamps to light rooms and flats.
Это такая баночка.
It was a jar
Доставали, если доставали.
containing transformer oil,
Доставали
motor oil.
масло, машинное масло,
There was no kerosene they could use, you know.
крохотный язычок пламени.
So a little tongue of flame burnt day after day,
Изо дня в день,
for weeks and months.
неделями, месяцами. Это было
It was the only lighting in houses.
в домах. Появились черные
So-called black markets appeared.
Там можно было купить
There you could buy a piece of bread, a
мешочек с крупой,
small bag of grain,
какую-то
some fish,
банку
a tin of preserves.
Все это выменивалось даже.
All that would be traded for a fur coat, valinki rather than for money. They would take anything that was valuable from home, paintings, silver spoons. And then there were bodies wrapped in sheets in the streets and in stairwells. When ice had grown stronger, a road of life was laid across Lake Ladoga. Vehicles began to make runs down the road, first to evacuate children, women, and the wounded, and then to bring foodstuffs to the city. The road was mercilessly bombarded. Shells broke the ice and vehicles went underwater. But there was no other way out. I was sent to the headquarters more than once, and I got to be in the city on several occasions. There I saw how the human nature of the besieged had changed. The city hero was a nameless passerby trying to lift a scrawny man who fell to the ground, exhausted. He would carry that man to a makeshift post with boiling water. There was nothing else there, and he'd offer him a cup of boiling water, and it often saved lives. Well, this was something. It was the compassion that had arisen in people. This one of the most important, or maybe the most important, hero of life under the siege. One day, in May 1942, when it had already turned warm and everything had thawed, and there was an infection danger in the city, where there were lots of dead bodies, our team of soldiers and junior officers was sent to the city to help carry the bodies to the cemetery. Interestingly, bodies lay in heaps near the cemetery, since family and friends tried to bring them there, but, of course, they were not strong enough to dig a grave in the frozen ground. So we loaded the bodies onto trucks. We threw them like sacks. They had dried out and were lightweight. The regiment doctor told us that this was the result of what people had been eating. Their bodies had eaten themselves. Never again in my life have I experienced that eerie feeling when we were loading them onto vehicles. The evacuation brought some problems of its own. One woman told how she went to Finlandsky railway station with her children. Her son, who was 14 years of age, walked behind her while she was pulling her little daughter on a sledge. She brought her to the terminal, But her son fell behind on the way. He was absolutely exhausted, very skinny. She didn't know what had happened to him. She remembered that cruel loss. And as she was talking to us, she thought of it as her own guilt. There were other problems too. Alexei Kosygin, the deputy chairman of the Soviet government, was sent to Leningrad as an authorized representative of the State Defense Committee. He told me what kind of a problem he faced every day. He had to choose between sending children, women, and the wounded down the road of life to the mainland, or transporting materials, machines, non-ferrous metals, and tools for military factories in the Urals. That problem of choice between people and equipment required for the defense industry was a frequent problem, he says, and it was most distressful and hopeless. Typical announcements posted throughout the city offered services like holding funerals, digging graves, carrying the dead to cemeteries, all those for a portion of bread, a tin of preserves. Strings of dead bodies of Red Army men floated down the Neva in spring. But people continued to take water from the Neva all the same, pushing the bodies away. What else could they do? They had to drink that water. We, on the front line, had tried to break through the siege circle since July of 1942. But in vain. Our attacks were repelled one after another. We lost. Our army lost 130,000 men over a few months, trying to breach the fortifications on the other side of the Neva. I was once given a diary of a boy who kept it while besieged. Many people kept diaries. In fact, diaries appeared to be the most reliable source of information. Because when we questioned siege survivors a decade after, the reminiscences of true events had been mixed with all the things that people saw in the cinema and theater or read in newspapers. A diary, however, was the reality, the truth of that time, here and now. What was recorded the same or the next day. So I was given the diary of that boy. He was 14 years old, and he lived with his mother and sister. The diary staggered me and others. That was a long time ago when we collaborated on this project. That was a story of conscience. At bakeries, they would try to ration out bread to the gram. The allowance was tiny. They would weigh it thoroughly. And then they would add another small piece to achieve accuracy. And so he was going back home with bread. He had been sent out for bread by his mother and sister. Starved, he was tempted to eat those little extra pieces and go unpunished. I mean, none of his family knew whether he had been given that little piece or not, except that he knew. Now he writes in his diary about his secret. He did it. He couldn't withstand the temptation and ate that piece. So he blames and kicks himself and swears it would never happen again. Because that piece, it's for the three of them. They shared the flat with another family. The husband held an important position and had an additional ration, which seemed to be a sizable one. His wife used to cook porridge and soups in the kitchen. The boy could smell them, and that was like an ordeal for him. He was tempted to scoop out some porridge with his hand as she was going out of the kitchen. He tried to hold himself back, and he did. That's the story of conscience. The desire to remain decent, to avoid dehumanization. It was typical of most of the besieged. As Adamovich and I were writing our book on the siege, I kept asking how they managed to survive. How did you survive? Interestingly, many people said, and it was evident from many stories, that in many cases, not in all of them of course, those who survived were those who saved others. They saved others by standing in lines, fetching water, melting ice and snow, tending the sick. Those who survived helped others to survive. Such a standard of compassion and mercy, it was quite a typical feeling during the siege. It helped people to stand out. For the concern of those who remained in the city and did not engage in warfare, their concern was to remain human. We at the front line also had a very short allowance and were also hungry. We ate boiled grass, nettle. Nonetheless, that was incomparable with what was happening in the city. You see, when writing this book, we asked ourselves a question. How could it have been so? Why did it happen? At the front line, the enemy was very well aware of what was happening in the city, learning about it from those who were fleeing and Secret Service agents. They were aware of all the horrors of hunger and, generally, of existence in such conditions. And they were waiting, even though it was possible to wait for 1, 2, or 3 months. But they waited 900 days. I believe that soldiers should fight against soldiers. A war is purely soldiers' business. And in that case, it was hunger that was sent to fight instead of soldiers. Being on the front edge, for a long time I couldn't forgive the Germans for that expectation of capitulation, the expectation of the city's end. The memory has faded over the years, of course. And I understand that the war I went through, it is always dirt and blood. Any war. We had enough of both. Tremendous losses in our army, our division. Only a third of personnel were alive after just a few months. I had hesitated long enough to write about my war. Nevertheless, I have recently written a novel about my personal war. How I fought all those years. Why did I write it? I can't even say exactly. I must have had some strange and latent desire to tell all my perished brother soldiers who died without knowing that we would win, died with a feeling of utter defeat, confident that we would abandon Leningrad, that Leningrad would not survive. I wanted to tell them that we had actually won, that they had not died for nothing, that we had achieved victory, and it was a just one. You know, there must exist a kind of sacred place within, where a person regains his compassion and sympathy and spirituality, and the realization of the miracle of victory. It's probably that justice, love of life, and of your fellow man prevails. Thank you.